The prohibited fix that kept old tractors running for 40 years without failing. There's a reason why you'll still see 1940s and 1950s tractors running strong on farms across America today, long after their manufacturers went out of business or stopped supporting them. And it's not because farmers back then bought better equipment. It's because they knew something that modern mechanics have mostly forgotten, something the tractor companies absolutely did not want them doing. Walk into any rural auction in the Midwest today and you'll find them. Farmall H tractors from 1944, John Deere Model Bs from 1938, Minneapolis Moline U's from 1953, still running, still working, still pulling plows and powering hay balers like they did when Truman was president. Ask the owners how they've kept these machines alive for 70, 80 years, and if they trust you enough, they might tell you about the fix, the one their grandfathers taught them, the one that wasn't in any service manual, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why this repair method became so crucial and why it was effectively prohibited, you need to understand what farming was really like in the 1930s and 40s when these tractors first started replacing horses and mules across American farmland. The transition from animal power to mechanical power wasn't some smooth, celebrated march of progress. For most farmers, it was terrifying. A good team of draft horses cost maybe $300 in 1935. You could feed them from crops you grew yourself. If they got sick, you knew how to doctor them, or you knew someone who did. They reproduced themselves, creating more work animals without you spending another dime. And when they got too old to work, they still had value. A new tractor in 1935 cost anywhere from $600 to $1,500. That's real money we're talking about, the equivalent of $15,000 to $40,000 today. And that was just the purchase price. Tractors needed gasoline or kerosene, which you had to buy. They needed oil, which you had to buy. They needed parts, which you had to buy. And when they broke down, which they did constantly in those early years, you needed a mechanic who understood engines, and there weren't many of those in rural counties across Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, or Missouri. But the math was undeniable. One tractor could do the work of 6 horses. You could plow twice as much ground in half the time. You could work longer hours because the machine didn't get tired. You didn't need to maintain pastures for grazing or grow oats for feed. You didn't need a barn full of harnesses and collars and the 100 other pieces of equipment that came with horse farming. The tractor was the future, and farmers who wanted to survive the Depression and compete in modern agriculture knew they had to make the leap. So they mortgaged their farms. They took out loans they could barely afford. They bought tractors. And then they lived in constant fear that something would break and they wouldn't be able to fix it. The companies knew this fear, and they exploited it mercilessly. International Harvester, John Deere, Alice Chalmers, Case, Massey Harris, every manufacturer operated the same way. They designed their tractors with proprietary parts that could only be purchased from authorized dealers. They refused to publish detailed repair manuals that would allow independent mechanics to service the machines. They threatened dealers who sold parts to unauthorized repair shops. They created a system where farmers were completely dependent on the company and its dealer network for every repair, every replacement part, every moment of downtime. And the companies had another trick, planned obsolescence before anyone called it that. They would manufacture a part, say a governor housing or a carburetor body, for 2 or 3 years. Then they would change the design slightly, just enough that the old part wouldn't fit the new models. Then they would stop making the old part. If your 1937 tractor needed that specific part in 1942, you were out of luck. The company would happily sell you a new tractor, but they wouldn't sell you the part you needed to fix the old one. This wasn't a mistake or an accident. Internal company documents that came to light decades later showed deliberate policies to discontinue parts for older models to encourage farmers to buy new equipment. One International Harvester memo from 1948 explicitly stated that the goal was to make tractors older than 10 years economically unrepairable to drive replacement sales. For farmers, this was devastating. A tractor that cost a year's income that they were still making payments on would become worthless junk because a 50-cent part broke, and the company wouldn't make that part anymore. It was theft, pure and simple, But it was legal theft and there was nothing farmers could do about it through official channels. So they did something unofficial. They started fixing their tractors in ways the companies definitely did not authorize. The specific repair that became legendary among farmers, the one that kept more old tractors running than any other, involved the engine block itself. And to understand why this particular fix was so important, you need to understand the single biggest weakness in those early tractor engines. Water jackets. Every engine needs cooling, and these tractors used water that circulated through passages cast directly into the engine block and cylinder head. The problem was that this was the 1930s and 1940s. Farmers didn't have antifreeze like we know it today. Ethylene glycol antifreeze existed, but it was expensive and not widely available in rural areas. Most farmers used plain water in summer and drained their radiators completely in winter. Or they used kerosene mixed with water or alcohol mixed with water, both of which lowered the freezing point, but not nearly enough for a hard winter in Minnesota or the Dakotas. What happened when water froze in an engine block was catastrophic. Water expands when it freezes, and that expansion was powerful enough to crack cast iron like it was glass. You'd come out to your tractor shed on a February morning after a cold snap, find that you forgot to drain the radiator or the temperature dropped lower than expected, and discover a crack running through your engine block, sometimes 3 or 4 inches long, sometimes clear through from the water jacket to the cylinder bore. When that happened, you had a few options, none of them good. You could order a new engine block from the dealer, which cost anywhere from $200 to $500 and took weeks or months to arrive, assuming they still made that block. You could try to trade the whole tractor for whatever scrap value you could get and try to scrape together money for a new one. Or you could do what the companies explicitly said you should never, ever do. You could weld cast iron. Now, here's where we need to talk about metallurgy for a minute, because understanding why this was considered impossible is crucial to understanding why the fix was so remarkable. Cast iron and steel are both mostly iron, but their carbon content and structure are completely different. Steel is malleable and ductile, with carbon content below 2%. It can be bent, shaped, and most importantly, welded relatively easily. Cast iron has much higher carbon content, up to 4%, and it's hard, brittle, and has a crystalline structure that makes it behave differently when heated and cooled. When you weld steel, you heat it until it melts, add filler metal, let it cool, and you get a strong joint. The metal transitions smoothly from solid to liquid and back to solid. When you try to weld cast iron using the same process, you create a disaster. The rapid heating causes the carbon to separate out as graphite flakes. The intense heat creates stresses in the crystalline structure. Then, when it cools, those stresses cause the metal to crack even worse than before, often in multiple directions radiating out from your attempted repair. Every engineering manual, every technical bulletin from the tractor companies, every official source said the same thing. Cast iron cannot be welded, especially not a cast iron engine block under pressure from combustion and cooling water. If your block cracks, it's scrap. End of story. But farmers didn't have the luxury of accepting that story. They had crops to plant, fields to plow, mortgages to pay. They needed their tractors running, and they needed them running now, not after they saved up $500 for a new block that might not even be available anymore. So they figured it out. Not through engineering degrees or metallurgy textbooks, but through trial and error, desperation, and the accumulated wisdom of blacksmiths, railroad workers, and practical men who'd been repairing metal things on the frontier for generations. The method that emerged, passed from farmer to farmer, from father to son, shared in low voices at farm auctions and equipment swaps, became known by different names in different regions. Some called it slow welding, some called it draw filing and brazing, some didn't call it anything at all. They just knew how to do it. But the principle was always the same. First, you had to clean the crack absolutely perfectly. This meant draining the entire cooling system, drying the engine completely, then using a grinding wheel or files to remove every trace of oil, rust, scale, or contamination from the crack and several inches around it. This step alone could take hours. Many farmers learned the hard way that skipping this step or doing it halfway meant the repair would fail immediately. Next came the most crucial and counterintuitive part of the entire process: You had to preheat the entire engine block, not just the area around the crack, the entire block. This is where the fix violated every principle of welding as it was taught in trade schools and understood by professional welders. The whole point of welding was supposed to be localized heat. You heated a small area, made your repair, and let it cool. Fast and efficient. But with cast iron, fast was the enemy. Fast heating created thermal stress. Fast cooling created brittleness and new cracks. The only way to weld cast iron successfully was to heat the whole mass slowly, keep it hot during the repair, then let it cool slowly, sometimes over 24 to 48 hours. So farmers developed methods. Some built coal fires in pits and set the entire engine block in the coals, rotating it periodically to ensure even heating. Some used blowtorches, moving them constantly around the entire block for an hour or more. Some removed the block from the tractor completely, took it to the local blacksmith shop, and used the forge to bring it up to temperature. The goal was to get the entire casting to between 400 and 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing dull red in darkness, warm enough that you couldn't hold your hand within a foot of it. Only then, with the entire block at working temperature, could you begin the actual repair. Now here's where different farmers used different techniques, depending on what equipment they had access to and who taught them. Some used actual welding equipment, oxyacetylene torches with special cast iron welding rods. These rods had high nickel content, which stayed softer and more ductile than regular steel, allowing them to bond with the cast iron without creating stress fractures. The welder would work slowly, adding tiny amounts of material, frequently reheating the area, never letting the metal cool below working temperature. Others used a brazing technique, working with brass or bronze rods that melted at lower temperatures than steel, but still bonded with cast iron when applied properly. Brazing didn't create as strong a bond as welding, but it also created less thermal stress and was more forgiving. For cracks that didn't extend all the way through to a cylinder bore, brazing often worked perfectly. The absolute masters of this repair, though, used a method called mechanical locking, combined with brazing. They would drill a series of small holes along both sides of the crack, then thread those holes and screw in soft iron plugs, creating a mechanical connection across the crack. Then they would braze over the entire repair, filling the crack and covering the plugs. This created both a mechanical bond and a sealed joint that could withstand pressure and temperature cycling for decades. But regardless of which technique they used, the critical factor that made the repair work was the cooling process. After the crack was filled and sealed, the farmer had to keep the entire engine block hot while it cooled slowly. This meant burying it in sand or ashes, wrapping it in insulation, or leaving it in the forge overnight. The goal was to let the temperature drop no more than 100 degrees per hour, allowing the metal to relax and anneal rather than shocking it with rapid cooling that would create new stresses. A proper cast iron engine block repair could take 2 to 3 days from start to finish when you included the preheating, the repair itself, and the controlled cooling. But when it was done right, that block was fixed, not temporarily patched, not limping along until it failed again, but genuinely fixed. Farmers who learned this method kept tractors running for 30, 40, 50 years after the manufacturers said they were unrepairable. And the companies hated it, absolutely hated it. Tractor manufacturers had entire business models built around parts sales and planned obsolescence. They needed farmers to believe that cracked blocks meant buying new tractors. When farmers started successfully repairing supposedly unrepairable engines, it threatened the whole system. So the companies fought back. They issued service bulletins stating that any welding on engine blocks voided all warranties and absolved them of any liability. They pressured dealers to refuse service or parts to any tractor that showed evidence of being welded. They published technical articles in farm magazines educating farmers about the dangers of welding cast iron, warning about catastrophic failures that could cause injury or death. Some of this was genuine concern. A poorly done cast iron repair could fail under pressure, potentially causing hot water or oil to spray out, or in rare cases causing engine damage. But most of it was about protecting revenue streams. Internal company correspondence from this era, now available in historical archives, shows executives explicitly discussing how to discourage farmers from repairing equipment themselves. The companies even lobbied for state regulations that would have required anyone performing welding repairs to be licensed, which would have effectively made this farmer-to-farmer repair method illegal. Those regulations failed, largely because rural legislators understood that farmers needed to be able to fix their own equipment, but the manufacturers' intentions were clear. Despite all this opposition, the knowledge spread. Korean War veterans who'd learned welding in the military came home and applied those skills to their farms. County extension agents quietly shared information about proper repair techniques. Equipment dealers who were farmers themselves before they became businessmen would pull aside trusted customers and explain how it was really done. The Ford Motor Company's decision to publish detailed service manuals for their tractors in the 1950s, including some information about cast iron repair, broke the wall of secrecy, and other manufacturers were eventually forced to follow suit. By the 1960s, you could find welding equipment on almost every farm of significant size in the Midwest. Farmers didn't advertise what they were doing, but they were systematically extending the life of their equipment far beyond what the manufacturers intended. A 1947 Farmel M that should have been replaced by 1957 was still running in 1977 and still running today because some farmer's grandfather knew how to properly weld a cracked block. The economic impact of this cannot be overstated. Thousands of farm families stayed solvent during tough years because they could keep old equipment running instead of taking on debt for new machines. Small farmers could compete with larger operations because they weren't locked into constant equipment upgrade cycles. Rural communities maintained their independence because they weren't completely dependent on corporate supply chains. And the tractors themselves became something more than just machines. They became proof that you didn't have to accept what big companies told you. They became evidence that with knowledge, skill, and determination, ordinary people could solve problems that experts declared unsolvable. They became family heirlooms, passed from grandfather to father to son, not just because they still worked, but because they represented a particular kind of American stubbornness that said, "I'll fix it myself." You can still see this legacy today. Drive through rural Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska, and you'll spot them in farmyards and equipment sheds, tractors that rolled off assembly lines during World War II, still wearing their original paint under decades of weathering, still starting up when you need them. Pull one into a modern shop and put it on a lift, and you'll often find the telltale signs. A braze line running across the engine block, a series of small plugs along a crack. Evidence that someone somewhere refused to accept that their tractor was unrepairable. The manufacturers eventually adapted. Modern engine blocks use different alloys that are more forgiving. They design them with replaceable cylinder sleeves that can be swapped without replacing the entire block. They publish repair information and sell parts for older equipment, though often at premium prices. They learned, slowly and reluctantly, that farmers would figure out how to fix things regardless of official policy, so they might as well sell them the parts and keep some control over the process. But that original fix, that prohibited repair that kept old tractors running for 40 years without failing, remains a perfect example of what made American farmers so resilient. They didn't have engineering degrees. They didn't have unlimited resources. What they had was necessity, ingenuity, and a refusal to be told something couldn't be done. They took a metallurgical challenge that engineers said was impossible. They developed a solution using basic equipment and patient technique. They shared that knowledge through informal networks that corporations couldn't control, and they kept their farms running, their families fed, and their independence intact. The next time you see one of those old tractors still working after 70 or 80 years, understand what you're really looking at. You're seeing a machine that was built to last, sure, but more than that, you're seeing evidence of a time when farmers knew their equipment intimately, when they had to know it because their survival depended on it. You're seeing the physical result of knowledge passed down through generations, of skills learned not from books, but from watching, from trying, from failing, and trying again until you got it right. You're seeing a middle finger to planned obsolescence cast in iron and bronze, still running strong after all these years. And that's the real story of the prohibited fix. Not just a welding technique, but a demonstration of what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept artificial limitations. The tractor companies said it couldn't be done, so farmers did it anyway. They said the parts weren't available, so farmers made them work. They said old equipment was obsolete, so farmers kept it running for half a century. That's the American spirit we talk about so much, but rarely see so perfectly demonstrated. Not in accepting what you're told by authorities or experts, but in figuring out your own solutions. Not in buying the newest model every few years, but in maintaining and respecting what you have. Not in dependence on corporate systems, but in self-reliance and community knowledge. Those old tractors are still out there, still working, still proving that the fix worked. They're a rolling testimony to the ingenuity of the men who refused to let companies dictate whether their equipment lived or died. They're proof that sometimes the experts are wrong, the impossible is just difficult, and there's always a way if you're determined enough to find it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this story about American farming history interesting and want to see more content about the techniques, innovations, and forgotten knowledge from our agricultural past, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button to help this video reach other people who appreciate these stories, and share it with anyone who loves learning about how previous generations solved problems with ingenuity and determination. This video is inspired by real historical events and farming practices, and is not intended to represent or offend any individual or organization. We'll see you in the next one.